Okay, so we have gotten, so far in the project, but I think it's time that we start talking about how do we actually kind of lay out and make a book. This doesn't have to be a very complicated process, and I would encourage you, if you've never made a book, maybe start out with making a zine. A zine is just, it could be a really simple magazine. You can order them from a lot of different print houses. You can have one printed. You could have a lot of them printed. You just kind of have to make the choice of what it is that you really want, what your goals are for your project. I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about, making very precise selections upon the, type of book. Is it a hardcover? Is it a soft cover? I mean, we could talk for hours about making those particular selections, material selections, and maybe if that's something you all are interested in, I can do more videos about that kind of more in detail later on. But I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of how you can do this, and a couple of ways to do this, or at least a couple of kind of thought processes on laying out a book. Um, but the first part of it is you really need to decide, you know, what what type of book do I want, and really what size of book do you want. And without going into a ton of detail, you should start generally by looking at the type of work that you're creating and thinking about how you want someone to interact with it. Generally speaking, just generally speaking, smaller books are going to feel a lot more intimate to the viewer, just like reading a diary or something. A small book feels very intimate, while a larger book can be very big and kind of monolithic and sometimes overwhelming. So if you have like this large landscape work, you might want a larger book to really see the full resolution and scale of those images. But if you have like some family work that's really tender, or something that's kind of more intimate, you might want a smaller book. So, there's a lot of different thought processes behind this, the overall scale of the book. Is it a square book? Is it a rectangle? What are the dimensions of the book? All these things you have to take into consideration. But I would say if you're doing your first book, I would choose a place that you're going to print most likely, and I would look at what their standard options are. A lot of places have like 8.5 by 11 as a book size, or something about half that size, which is like 5.5 by 8.5 inches. I would stick to something really simple, and that's how I would set my document up. You can always change your document after the fact, but if you're starting out, just choose something simple. And if you're on a really tight budget, maybe you do something that's more like a magazine, maybe it's smaller. I would say there's a lot of, you can spend $6 on having something printed. You could spend, $600 on a single thing being printed and made and crafted. So I would just encourage you, start off simple, until you start to build, your language visually with your book, and figuring out what you really want from that object. So I'm going to show you two books that I'm working on, kind of that are, one of them is basically, they're both ready to be printed essentially. One of them is going to be printed through a publisher, through Fall Line Press. And the other one I'm self-publishing. Okay, so far we've been looking at the work that I'm going to self-publish, which is called Hide Me in the Honeysuckle Patch. But I want to show you kind of a little bit of what you can look forward to in the book that I'm going to publish with Fall Line Press, which is a book called The 13th Spring. That work was probably my first major project, major body of work that I'm really happy with. And I've been really fortunate to work with Fall Line. And so in the near future, we'll be having more, updates on that, on how you can pre-order the book and things like that. But I was going to show you, kind of roughly what that looks like in the layout. And this is going to give us, one way to lay out a book. So this work is very personal to me. It's very quiet. It's very tender. And so this book, the way that it is laid out, is very simple. Really, really simple, really quiet. Where the pictures are on the page is really simple. So if we go into, I use InDesign to lay out all my books. I would say if you have, an Adobe subscription, InDesign is what everybody uses. It's really a simple program. You can really just drag and drop your images in there to lay them out. I would say the best thing to do is to, when you prep your files for InDesign, is you definitely want to you want to have the highest quality file possible. So if I'm working in Lightroom, then I'll export TIFFs for to be put in InDesign. You could do the full resolution, but oftentimes I'll downsize the resolution to the maximum size that I would need in my book. So if I know that if I'm going to do a 2-page spread and that spread is, at most going to be 16 inches wide, then I'll make sure all my pictures are no wider than 16 inches at 300 DPI. And I'll export them as TIFFs so that I have the maximum amount of information there for my document. So if we go in here, you'll see kind of like where I would encourage most people to start with laying out a book. Now, I'm not a designer. I've just been doing this for a little while, so I kind of design based upon my own language. So in this book, it's most of the images land on the right-hand side of the page. They're all the exact same size. Again, this is a very quiet book. So I don't want a lot of movement from the design. I want the attention to be really to the images. If you're in InDesign, a good thing to remember is if you just hit W, it'll remove all of your guides and everything. So if we work through here, we can kind of see that these images, most of them are on the right-hand side, they're exact same size, and then sometimes that changes. But I will give myself a marker or a guide to go by to know exactly where those images line up. So if I turn my guides back on, you'll see there's a little guideline that I pulled down here. If you just go into your master pages, which are kind of to the upper right in your pages tab, if you double click, says a master. If you double click on that, whatever changes you make to this master, it'll apply to every page in the document unless you tell it otherwise. So with general guides, if I have something that's using the same kind of guide mark, if the images, most of them are going to be placed the same place on the page, I'll give myself a guide to go by so that everything matches up perfectly. So if I just go back to my document here, this is a really basic layout. The further I go into this, you'll see that this, we stick with this kind of basic design until we get to, sometimes there's 2 photos in a spread, but those are kind of all things are equal there. Again, it stays very simple, and this is using the same sequence that I worked on with this body of work before. And then sometimes I'll break that with, let's get further down here, there's an image that's larger than the other. So this is a really simple way to lay something out. I just give myself 1 or 2 very specific rules, and I stick with those rules as I'm laying out the pictures, okay? So that's one way to do it, very simple. Another way that I've been working with is the way that I laid out the work that I've been showing you all through these series of videos, this work called Hiding in the Honeysuckle Patch. This book I'll self-publish. I'll just do a few copies of it just to get the work out there, just to kind of, I think about the 13th Spring as a very large album almost. And I think about this second body of work as kind of a small book of poetry. So while the 13th Spring, the book will be, I think, 9 or so inches by 11 or 12 inches. It's a bigger book. The Hiding in the Honeysuckle Patch will be a very small book. It'll be a little more intimate. Both are going to be hardcover books, case bound. So in the Hiding in the Honeysuckle Patch, you'll see that the way that it's laid out is going to be very different than the 13th Spring. We start off with a very simple image. And then as we move through, you'll see that we work in kind of like a totally black environment. So let me see what this is going to look like in real life. And then if I hit Shift W, it'll give me kind of like a full look at the spread, how everything will look kind of roughly. And when I'm laying this out, I'm really thinking about the movement on the page. I'll think about where the focal point of the image is and how that corresponds aesthetically with the subsequent images. And I give myself a lot of freedom to move my images around the page in order to construct kind of a new composition in some way. So the big things that you want to look out for those when you're doing this is you have a gutter in the middle of your book. That's where the book opens up, where the pages, are bound together. If you have a case bound book or a saddle stitch book or a book that is like saddle staple bound, you'll be able to open the book all the way and see into that gutter. But still, you want to keep important information right out of that area, because you don't want to break right in the middle of a very important part of the picture. So you want to make sure the really important part of the pictures are not in the gutter. If you're using a perfect binding where the pages are glued on the edge, that book is not going to open up as easily, so you're actually going to lose a lot more in the gutter. So you want to be careful around your gutter if you're, depending on the binding style that you're using. I tend to avoid perfect binding if I can. I would rather have a saddle stitched magazine than a perfect bound book, just so that I can see deep into the gutter. But I'll keep that in mind as I'm laying this out. So we start here with the truck, and our important thing is kind of to the center, to the left. So I move that picture over to the left-hand side of the page. He's waving, and then he waves over across the gutter to this child and his mother. And again, I'm thinking about how the eye is going to move across those pages as I continue to move through. Let's see. We have the child on the right-hand side of the page, and then we'll actually move back to the left-hand side of the page. There's a little bit of a ping-ponging that happens back and forth with the movement of the faces, because the faces are going to be very dominant. And then I'm going to try to start lining things up. So we have the child here on the left-hand side of the page. And then because of the lines of this truck, how they move, that's going to correspond with the next spread. The lines move across and follow this arm to this baby's face here, okay? That's going to move me back to the other spread. Again, the face is going to be very dominant as I move to my next spread. This item in the middle of the picture, this tarp here, is landing kind of where the face of the child is on the previous spread. So again, like our eye tends to focus towards this area of the frame. So in the next spread, I try to place the dominant thing in that area as well. Okay, now I might not do that for every picture that the dominant thing is the exact place of the book, but I know that the person's eye is going to be there. So whenever they turn the page, I want to know that that's where their eye is going to start or pick up, possibly. We read photo books differently than we read a regular book. A regular book, you open it up, you start at the top left and you work your way down, and you go to the right-hand page at the top left and you work your way down. With photo books, your eye is going to be looking at the whole spread as a singular composition. So wherever we left off in the previous spread, there's going to be a little bit of a latent image in someone's mind. So as they flip to the next page, they're going to either gravitate towards that area, or they're going to see the absence of something in that area, possibly. These are, general rules that I use. There's, of course, different ways to lay things out and different thoughts behind that, but that's kind of what I think about. It's like, what did they just see, and where does that take them, visually on the spread on the next page? So where this chain falls here, I make sure that this happens again, where the child is there where that chain was in a previous page. Again, that helps to reinforce that. But at some point, I do want to break that repetition that I'm doing, the way that I'm laying the book out and bringing someone's eye to a very specific part of the book. So I have this big double page spread of this big, honeysuckle, kind of like wild vine, all these, all this shrubbery here. But still, the dominant thing in the picture, the brightest thing, are these little flowers right here. So when I go to the next spread, I have a girl holding a flower, and it's landing roughly where those other flowers were again. So this always gives me a good kickoff. Now I want to move across the gutter now, because my next picture is going to be very dominant on the left-hand side of the photo. So I've chosen this picture as well because the arm gives me a leading line to kind of go to the left in the spread. And so in my next spread, I have a little girl that her arms are going out in that same kind of angle, that line across the gutter to this little girl. So once I get here and have her here, again, I want to mind the gutter and not have this little boy right in the gutter. He's going to be a little bit cut off, but she's the dominant part of the image. Then when I move on to this tree, if you'll see, her arms are up like this, making this angle. The next image is of a tree, and this tree also has this kind of diagonal angle going on. So a lot of the ways that I connect my pictures aesthetically, I'm also looking for, when I'm laying them out in my book, and I want something that's a little more active in how it moves around the spreads, I will place those, to overlap certain, compositional things in the picture. And if the picture gives me a lot of movement from one side to the other, I'll know that as my eye moves through that picture within the next spread, I might want to land or start in the next spread where I've ended up in the last picture. All of this is just like activating a certain amount of movement to my eye, because those lines, again, there's going to be like a little imprint in our imagination of what we've just seen. And that's, if that corresponds well with the picture, the next picture, then our brain is going to say there's a connection here, there's an association here. And that's what we do with the photo book typically, is we want to make association between images, fragmented images. So, this is generally the idea that I move through. On every page, I just have a single picture, and I just move those pictures around. Sometimes I'll change the sizes slightly. Sometimes I'll go to a big double page spread. I give myself a lot fewer rules, but I just want to be somewhat consistent. Like having a single picture on each, page. I don't have two pictures on a spread in this particular layout, but you could totally do that. But again, if you, create rules and go by those structures as you're laying something out, and you want to help the person move through the book visually with what they're seeing, until they get to, the very end of the book. Now, once I have my book totally laid out, once we get to our final images and we get where we're going, generally speaking, I like to have a colophon in the back, and that just gives some general information about, details from the book, what edition is it, the copyright information, things like that. And that's generally what I have in a book, in a really basic book. And this is a really basic book. And I would say just start there. If you're adding text to a book, that's great. Work the text in there with the images. I don't put a lot of text in my book. I like to write a couple of poems or a little small excerpt to kind of lead a person through a work. That's not really my specialty, is like the word and the image. There's other people that know and do that in a much better way than I do. And I would encourage you to seek those people out. But this will at least kind of give you a place to start with throwing things in there. Now, I didn't talk about really how to use InDesign. There's tutorials out there. Just look them up. There's plenty of ways you can learn how to use InDesign. I'm more concerned with how can I just use that tool to accomplish my task? And my task is to take disparate images, link them together in a good sequence, and then as they translate into a book, how can I allow that sequence to, give the appropriate voice in the layout, in the design. In this design, I wanted it all to be on black. I wanted it to be very, dark and kind of feel heavy, and, that it felt right. So this whole book is all black and white, and all the backgrounds are completely black. And the images are on these black backgrounds. And, it's something I thought about a lot about, this is a simple thing, but I feel like this is the way that the work feels in my mind better. And I know that's not very, concrete. But eventually we want to get to that place to where our layouts and our things, they have a logical, they make sense logically. There's a reason behind why we move around the page or around the spread the way that we do. But also, we want them to feel right. If you are the person that's making these pictures, you're now responsible not only for what's inside the frame, but what's outside of the frame in that page of that book. And so, if there's two pictures on a page, how do they speak to each other? If it's one picture, if it's very small, does it cause the person to look in? If it's really large, does it cause someone to look back and look at every detail on the picture? If the background is, totally black, how does that make the viewer feel? If the background's totally red, how does that make the viewer feel? All of these things can add to and complement your work, and complement your photographs in the book form. But it takes time to kind of develop a language and develop your own language for making books. And so, like I said at the beginning, I would encourage you, make a bunch of books, even if you're just printing off a little book on your, on your printer at home, or a color copier, and stapling it together. All of those things help grow, your own sensibility as an artist, and as making, how you make a book. Not everything is logical, and not everything has a rule necessarily, but I would say everything has a framework, and that framework differs based upon the book. Just like, every song has a different rhythm, has a different beat. There's different instruments that are used to create that space. And with our books, that's what we want to do. So I would just encourage you, make some simple zines or make some simple books. Even if it's like go to Blurb or something and make a book and order one, or go to MagCloud and have a book printed, something really simple. That kind of stuff can really inform how you create books, but it can't just be done digitally. You have to have a physical version of it somewhere. So maybe, when I make the next video, whatever that's going to be about, we can talk more about publishing and, do I self-publish? Do I publish with a big publisher? What are some self-publishing options? What is it like working with a publisher? All these things we can maybe talk about, because I know I've had people ask me questions about that in the past, and I would love to share my experience and why I choose to do one thing or the other, possibly. So if you have questions, please feel free to message me, post, questions on here. I'll be glad to help if I can, or shoot me an email. That's also a really easy way to get a hold of me. And hopefully this is just the beginning, but hopefully this gives you a place kind of to start to think about how to lay out my pictures, or lay out your pictures in a book.